I bet you're doing something right now. Maybe you're driving a car, in which case, watch the road. Maybe you're cleaning your apartment. I'm very sorry about that, if that's the case. Maybe you're typing on your laptop, trying to nail that big presentation for class or work. Whatever it is, I can guarantee you're multitasking, or at least trying to. We're all insanely busy. It feels like there are never enough hours in the day. And for students especially, the expectation of essays, assignments, interviews, well, can all feel like a very precarious seesaw, with social life on one end and school on the other. Today's episode is all about balance. The balance of work and school, the balance of one assignment versus another, the balance of life overall. This is Learning to Learn, a Coastline College podcast, and I can already feel the seesaw tipping. Joining me, as always, is Coastline Student Success Coordinator, Danny Pittaway. Danny, can you think of a time when your life-work balance was out of whack?
Absolutely. I can definitely think of times when I felt overwhelmed with various commitments. When you take on new challenges, it can easily spill over into what we call the life-work balance equation. Shaking things up can be exciting and rewarding, but it can also make it more challenging to establish a routine when you're adding something new to your life. I think in life, there's always the opportunity to take on a lot of things that can really make us feel like we're burning the proverbial candle on both ends.
I play the drums, and when you talk about routine, it makes me think of rhythm and creating a rhythm for ourselves that we can all maintain.
Yeah, I think optimally or ideally, we all want to have a satisfying rhythm in our lives. And we want what we do to feel sustainable and satisfying. But I think the word balance or striving for balance in our lives can actually be misleading. Human beings are not mechanical objects. So the idea that we should be striving to have a technical balance, such as I spend 50% of my time doing this and I spend 50% of my time doing that, is perhaps not so practical or useful. I think that life and happiness or success can't be reduced to a literal balance sheet. So that seesaw that represents our life-work balance perhaps isn't supposed to stand still.
Right. Seems like we're all trying to find an equilibrium, but you've raised this question of whether or not anyone is really even capable of achieving quote unquote complete balance or equilibrium, whatever term you want to use. And now that I think about it, I'm not even sure what complete balance would even look like. So I think what we're talking about is not necessarily getting rid of the seesaw, but learning to be okay with the imbalances that are going to arise and maybe finding some strategies that can help us manage it.
Yeah, exactly. For myself, the seesaw was often tipped in favor of school or studying, especially when I was in college and high school. And that was fine for me. I was happy with it that way. And as I've progressed through life and my career, the seesaw shifts, as it does. Wherever your seesaw leans, the key is, are you happy with where it is? And do you understand why it is where it is? It's going to be different for each person. And, one person's seesaw is not another's.
All of this makes me think of the elephant in the room right now, which I think is the pandemic. It's been this incredibly draining, taxing year. I think it's ground down at all of us, some definitely more than others, and laid bare these already very threadbare, fragile systems. How does that relate to this idea of balance, or rather the lack of balance?
Well, whatever your circumstances are now is what they are. That might mean 2 jobs in school. It might mean unemployment and school. Maybe you're taking care of relatives or family members and trying to balance jobs and school on top of it. As Claudia said in our previous episode, we've all piled our plates pretty high, and the pandemic may have just piled on our plates even more. Here on our podcast on Learning to Learn, we want to acknowledge those very real circumstances. And that's also to say that there's no quick fix to deal with life's challenges. But it is important to have a plan and to remember that you want to find joy in your daily life, to stop and smell the roses, as they say. And you also want to look toward the future, which can help motivate you to keep you going and keep you on the path that you've set for yourself.
Coming up on Learning to Learn, I speak with a first-generation college student on how she's worked to find balance in her studies and life. Stick around. All right. Hi, Natalie. Can you introduce yourself for me?
Hi, Saul. Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Tran. I am a fourth-year communication studies undergraduate at California State University, Fullerton, and I'm alumni of Coastline College.
And what was your first experience of college like?
Overwhelming. It was very overwhelming. My parents only went to school up until middle school, so I had no family history of any kind of education. When I started college, it was very overwhelming, not just with class registration, but feeling like I belong. I'm also Vietnamese American, and I was born in Vietnam and grew up in Little Saigon. So I didn't really know how to interact with folks. You know how in high school you address teachers as Mr. this and Mr. that. And in my culture, you don't call anyone by their first name. You either call everyone like a form of auntie or a form of like Mrs. So when I started going to college, it was so weird that I had to call my older coworkers by their first name. That's just a little something that was different about starting college.
No, yeah, that makes sense. I can imagine that would be kind of off-putting at first when you haven't done that for your whole life, and then to have to do that is just like super weird. What do you think it's like being a first-gen college student and experiencing kind of the entire complexity of the American educational system?
So the word that I would use to explain that again, it's very overwhelming. There's a lot of intricacies with imposter syndrome and trying to navigate these spaces, especially as a first-gen college student. You come into a space and not only do you have to know the processes of registering for class and these other kind of like functional, tangible things, you have to also along the way reassure yourself that this is where you belong. If you are a trailblazer in your own sense and you're the first person ever to do something like this, it feels really, for lack of a better word, whack to be in that kind of space. Different, overwhelming, different, but very exciting at the same time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Whack is a totally appropriate word for that. And you mentioned it just now, so I figured we could touch on it. This imposter syndrome that you're talking about, what was that like to experience that? Were there moments when it actually ended up helping you or hurting you, more or less during your schooling?
So imposter syndrome, I always consider that a double-edged sword. I actually didn't know about imposter syndrome, and I didn't know that I had it until about a year ago now when I was talking to my EOPS counselor, Claudia Mojica. With imposter syndrome, it's bad for all the obvious reasons. It's bad for the reasons that everyone knows. It makes you feel like you don't belong. And it has haunted me ever since I started college, even when I was going through high school without my knowledge. But at the same time, it has helped me in the sense that when you know that you are in the room with imposter syndrome, it shows that you are in uncomfortable spaces. And with that uncomfortable spaces, you can grow. So with imposter syndrome, even though it has caused me to overwork myself and neglect my work-life balance, it has shown me the importance of why it's so important for someone like a first-gen college student to have that work-life balance, for someone to know that it is amazing to have the opportunities that you do, but it's also important to maintain that balance, because with self-care, self-preservation, that's how you can make sure that you're able to continue doing what you're doing with, the outcome that you want.
Right. And you brought it up just then when you talk about work-life balance. How do you even find it when you're juggling so much?
To be honest, I am not at that stage of self-reflection to be able to answer that question yet. Work-life balance is a journey that it's a process that you are always going to try to do. It's like identity exploration, work-life balance, identity exploration. It takes a full life to be able to understand how to get to that. The older you get, when you transfer out of community college, when you get your first job, you continue to get busier and busier. You build more social circles, you increase your responsibilities. And I feel like with that, as you get older and you're doing all these things, there comes a breaking point where you realize like, I need to focus more on Natalie, or I need to focus more on Saul. And I think that's where you start trying to add in efforts to make sure that, yes, you are out there kicking ass and doing these things you're doing, but you're also making sure that you're taking time to take care of yourself.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and it's something I hadn't considered. Do you think we should like embrace that imbalance then?
I don't think so. I think that that lack of balance, that difficulty in maintaining that work-life balance, it just comes with the society we live in. And especially if you come from underprivileged educational situations, like a first-gen college student, it's very abundant. But I don't think we should embrace that unbalance, at least for, we shouldn't embrace that imbalance indefinitely. Even though I'm not at that point of self-reflection where I have a really good work-life balance, I know that I am putting in the effort to try to get that work-life balance. It is telling myself that, okay, after 10 p.m., I'm going to watch an episode of House of Cards and no more work. It is trying to get into painting. It is, and all of these things, all of these tangible things, yes, they account for work-life balance, but there's also that aspect of self-work, asking yourself, why am I working so hard at the time when I should be resting? And usually that comes back to imposter syndrome. That comes back to you trying to prove to not only others, but more importantly, prove to yourself that you're capable of doing the things that you're doing. So this idea of work-life balance, yes, you can paint, you can slap on a face mask, and you can do all these things. But the most important thing is that self-work piece where you identify the root of the imposter syndrome or whatever it is that you're feeling that is hindering you from that work-life balance.
That makes a lot of sense. I couldn't agree more with it, and very well said. And on that note, do you think you have advice for students on attending college, like who might be striving to find balance, and you kind of gave a piece of advice there about self-work. Do you have more advice on that front about how a student can juggle so many things?
My biggest advice for trying to find work-life balance is find a hobby. Find something that you enjoy to do, whether that is like a student organization in school or something outside of school. Find something that you can return to that is your enjoyable home base that you can turn to after a hard day of studying or of work.
And do you think it's important to have a support group maybe alongside that hobby, or someone outside of that hobby, or just a group of people or one person who can help almost take you in and out of that, going from I'm in school mindset to I'm in hobby mindset or I'm at home mindset?
Yes, of course. Support, a social support group is very important. And in work-life balance, I will address both. When it comes to work, we've mentioned this before in our cosign blog about student success, but that 5-point theory, the one where you find 5 different folks at school, the student to find 5 different folks at school to connect with, whether that is a faculty, an administrator, someone at school that you can go to for support. That is on the work side of things. But on the life side of things, you need to make sure that you have a support group who will check in with you, not just on your academic and professional success, but on your personal well-being too, whether that is friends, family, you name it.
I think often students think that they have to do it alone or by themselves. It's like, I am the student, you're not the student or they're not the student, so this is on me to do. And I know that's something that we're trying to cover in this podcast is you never do it entirely yourself. There's always people who are there to help you and guide you. And we all, not only are there people there to do that, but everyone needs that and is not just benefited from it, but everyone has had that in their lives. It's a fallacy to think that some people have gotten to the success they've gotten without other people's help. We all need other people's help, right?
Exactly. Higher education, college life, it's not an individual activity. It's a group activity. I definitely wouldn't be where I am right now if it wasn't for the amazing people at Cosign or the amazing people at Fullerton. And you probably wouldn't be where you are right now if it wasn't for the amazing people in your undergraduate life. Higher education, college, everything, it is a group activity. We spoke about this before, but like the hardest part about college isn't necessarily the classes, it's everything else. And all of those everything else entails, imposter syndrome, learning how to register for classes, learning how to buy a parking ticket, trying to feel like you fit in. And part of how we learn, how we fit in, is how we identify with other people and how we place ourselves in social groups. So wanting to feel like you fit in college, wanting to feel like you belong in college requires the interaction with other people, with people in your support group.
100%. And I know I always love that quote. The last time we spoke, and you said, the hardest part of college isn't the classes, it's everything else. I love that because it's so true, at least to my experience. I know it's true to other people's experience too. And it speaks to this aspect of juggling and work-life balance or balance in life in general. And for this episode, we have kind of the seesaw metaphor that we're playing with. This idea of like having things on one side that you prioritize more than another. And how do you do that? And I just love that quote because it speaks to that notion of like, there are challenges, but like you said, the classes is the common denominator for all students, right? Everybody has the classes, and that to some degree is the easy part. And then the hard part comes with all the other stuff where you have individual issues, like you have an imposter syndrome or anxiety or depression, or maybe, a learning disability or taking tests is like really hard. And that's all that individual stuff that is so challenging, but it's always worth remembering, like you said, that you are still part of a community and there are people there that can help. And what are your plans? I know you're almost graduating from Fullerton, and what are your plans for the future?
So starting July, I'll be moving in Cal State Long Beach. I recently got offered the position as an assistant residential life coordinator with international students. So I'll be working with international students in Cal State Long Beach Housing Department starting in July. And then I'm going to graduate school for my MS in Counseling and Student Development and Higher Education. So that is my short term. That's what my future has for me short term. And long term wise, I'm hoping to go back to something like EOPS or ultimately become a dean or a vice president, basically to be able to give back and help students feel like they belong in college the same way these amazing student affairs professionals helped me at my time in Coastline. I also wanted to add something. The seesaw metaphor that you spoke about earlier when it comes to work-life balance is interesting. I think, however, that metaphor could be a little restricting because it feels like yes, it is a balance, but realistically, when you think about it, you don't have to choose either work or your life. How I like to think about it is kind of like a wheel metaphor, right? At the center of that is Saul, or at the center of that is Natalie. And around me, I have my school, I have my, personal life, I have my whatever, like on the different spokes that connects to the tire. And along that circle, right? A wheel doesn't exist by itself. A wheel connects to a car, and that car could be the social support that uplifts you and keeps you up and keeps the wheel running. So I feel like when you think of work-life balance and all these other responsibility that comes with, living life as a human, when you think of a more open metaphor like that, it will allow you to not feel so constricted and so confined and feel like you either have to choose to, enjoy life for what it is or go out there and do the things that, that you need to do for your academic and professional career.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I feel totally schooled right now, but no, 100%. That makes a lot of sense in the best possible way. I agree. I think that it's a much better and more apt metaphor because the seesaw it removes this aspect of choice, and it feels, seesaw is going to fall one way or another no matter what, but that doesn't mean you have to. And there's always room in a person's life to find, opportunities to have a personal life, to have to the degree that they want. And that flexibility totally exists. That's a good new metaphor. So I appreciate that. Is there anything else that you want to add, that you want to touch on, or you feel like we missed in the conversation we had?
I think, all this talk about work-life balance, but I have one general advice for students. And I think that this advice I've learned how to internalize recently. It's really helped me too. And this advice is remember who you are, and who you are as a kick-ass person. So go out there and do the things that, go out there and kick some ass. So I know that that's a little unconventional advice, but I think it really helps when you are trying to, balance and juggle everything. And on the onset of this, in this like virtual learning environment too, if you are a student right now learning through COVID and everything, like huge kudos to you. Or if you're a student right now who is thinking about going to college in the middle of all of this, like that is really commendable. It takes a lot of motivation and it takes a lot of strength to continue to want to improve yourself in terms of higher academics in a virtual environment. So that's really great.
So I'm back with Danny Pitaway for some reactions to Natalie's very insightful interview. Danny, what stuck out to you about some of the things Natalie said?
Well, first of all, she really talked about investing in her future and investing her time and her energy right now for a future vision that she has for herself. At the same time, she's very grounded in her day-to-day activities and learns to take time to smell the roses, so to speak, which I think is very important. And finally, I was really struck by the wheel metaphor that she used, and basically talking about a circle of support to drive you forward.
Right. And how do you think what she talked about could be applied to students in general?
Well, I would say that it's important to believe in yourself and to realize that if you feel imposter syndrome, that's perfectly natural and normal to deal with that, and that it's something that can be overcome with time and effort, and that it's important to surround yourself with people who will build you up, who will support the goals that you have for yourself.
And as I mentioned in the interview, I have a very strong reaction to this quote of hers because I think it's so true to the college experience in general, which is the hardest part about college isn't the classes, it's everything else. What do you take away from that?
Yeah, what I take away from that is her very clear awareness of the challenge of entering a new environment or a new system and how that can be overwhelming and how that can actually spur imposter syndrome, where you may doubt whether or not you belong in this new environment or this new system that you're entering, whether it's college or whatever it may be. And it's therefore important to have resilience and to affirm to yourself that you do belong, and to acknowledge that, yes, there will be challenges, but you can overcome them.
Right. And I think that ties in with this notion of the circle of support that you talk about and that Natalie talks about. And having a support group around you and people, be that a professor, a tutor, a classmate, a friend, anyone who can really help you overcome things like imposter syndrome, or at least, learn to cope with them and to recognize that they're not crippling, or that it doesn't mean you don't deserve to be in the room learning with other people. And I'm sure that makes it extra hard for Natalie as a first-gen college student. And you already brought this up, which is the wheel analogy that Natalie talked about. And that was a great moment for me to reflect on the seesaw that we had created. And I think that unwittingly eliminated a lot of choice. Like you can have school or social life, but not both. And in a way, we didn't even consider the possibility Natalie was talking about. And I have to say, I was so happy to basically be proved wrong in the interview there with Natalie. And do you think we need to revise the seesaw into a wheel?
Yeah, I think the seesaw perhaps incorrectly sets up life as if it's a binary opposition, that you either have this or you have that, but you can't have both. And it's a very narrow metaphor. I like the wheel metaphor because it places the individual at the center and all of their various responsibilities and the people in their lives around them. And it's a much clearer metaphor and a more sustainable symbol for me when I think about life and making progress and going after your goals.
Another thing that stuck out to me while I was interviewing Natalie was how positive she was. I think she just had this really bright outlook on how things were going, and even on things that weren't necessarily going well, like the pandemic, or had not been going well, and on that note, she kind of ended with this totally unexpected piece of advice, which was remember who you are and who you are as a kick-ass person. So go out there and kick some ass. And I think that's becoming a bit of a through line in this podcast, basically, because with Claudia, what we were talking about is how failure doesn't make you any less of a deserving person. And with Natalie, what you can kind of add to that is even if you fail, or maybe because you sometimes fail, you are still a kick-ass person at the center of this supportive wheel that's driving you forward.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, failure and setback are not indications of some, personal, failing or problem that a person has. It's quite the contrary. Failures and setbacks are natural and to be expected. And it's incumbent on us to look at those situations, learn from them, and move forward. We're not supposed to look at failure as if it's some type of permanent judgment against our character forever and ever. It's not that at all. It's things happen, and we either learn from them or we don't. And I think that Natalie really demonstrates having a growth mindset. It's a term we often use in education to refer to the type of attitude and mindset where you actually embrace failure or stumbling and know that those are often the best opportunities to actually learn and to grow. And as human beings, we really should have that attitude where we're not afraid to fail, because if we're afraid to fail, we may be afraid to try. And then we may end up, not achieving our goals because we're allowing fear to get the best of us.
And what's the final thought on the episode in terms of balance, life work balance? What's the takeaway?
I think it's a complicated concept, especially when we try to equate life to some sense of balance. And I feel like it would be more appropriate instead to focus on awareness, to say that we may be spending the majority of our time every day doing work, right? Or doing whatever it is that a person may be doing, however they divide their time. And it's perhaps more productive and more useful to just examine whether or not we are fully aware of why we're doing what we're doing. And do we have a plan? Do we have a reason as to why we spend our days the way that we do? And if we do have a reason and we do have a plan, I think that's good. So that's all to say that striving for awareness of what we do and why we do it is perhaps more important than striving for some sense of balance, because I think the peace and serenity that comes from this idea of balance actually comes from a clear awareness of following a plan that you set for yourself in terms of what will make you happy, and just what will make you happy.
To bring this full circle, let's say you're multitasking or trying to. It may feel like there are never enough hours in the day, but at least you know there's a tomorrow. A sense of balance actually comes more from awareness of why you do what you do, and not so much by actually dividing your time in equal increments. It's a form of being present and mindful. Essentially, accepting imbalance becomes its own method of finding balance. As your wheel moves forward, always remember not to take your eyes off the road. And I guess I mean that both literally and figuratively. See you next time on Learning to Learn. Thank you to Natalie for her positive energy and stellar advice. This episode of Learning to Learn was hosted by yours truly, Saul Rubin, and co-hosted by Danny Pittaway. It was produced, edited, and written by Saul Rubin and co-written by Danny Pittaway. The L2L theme was written and produced by Elijah Rubin. Special thanks to Coastline College, Don Wilson, and the entire marketing team.